Depression is one of the most common mental health diagnoses out there. But what if the story we've all been told about it, how it's diagnosed and how it's treated, what if that's not the whole picture? Well, in this explainer, we're going to pull that story apart piece by piece.
All right, let's just dive right into the big one. For decades, many of us have heard this over and over. Depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. Simple as that. But what if that belief, as widely held as it is, isn't the full story? Our source material today suggests it's time to take a much closer look. So, before we even get to that theory, let's start with today, right now. How do we actually diagnose conditions like depression? How does a doctor look at someone and say, yes, you have it?
Think about it. When you go to a doctor, it doesn't usually start with a brain scan or a complex blood test. According to our source, it often kicks off with a series of questions, a lot like this one. You're asked to rate your own feelings, your own behaviors. It's all based on what you report.
And that's really the crucial takeaway here. According to the source, the diagnosis for depression isn't based on objective biological markers. There's no blood test that comes back positive. There's no brain scan that can definitively say, there it is. The entire diagnosis hinges on a person's subjective answers on a questionnaire.
So, this subjective way of diagnosing, well, it became the perfect gateway for a really powerful and frankly persistent idea, one that has shaped how we treat mental health for an entire generation.
And here it is, the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that low levels of a neurotransmitter called serotonin are the root cause of depression. It was a simple, compelling story, and it became the scientific foundation for prescribing a whole class of drugs you've definitely heard of, SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But, okay, hold on, because this is where the story takes a massive turn. The source for this explainer makes a pretty stunning claim, stating that this entire theory is, and I'm quoting here, hogwash. He argues there is zero concrete evidence that depression is actually caused by a serotonin deficiency. So, if the science behind it is being questioned so heavily, you have to wonder, right? Where did these diagnostic rules and the theory they're based on even come from? Well, to figure that out, we've got to go back and trace the origins. Now, this timeline, presented by our source, reveals a pretty striking pattern. The screening tool for ADHD, reportedly developed back in the 70s by a consultant for the company that makes Ritalin. Then you fast forward to the 90s, and the key questionnaire for depression was developed by a consultant for Pfizer, a huge producer of antidepressants. The argument here is that these simple questionnaires weren't just created to be helpful diagnostic tools. They were specifically designed to be so straightforward that any primary care doctor, not just a psychiatrist, could use them to quickly give a diagnosis and write a prescription. It essentially opened the floodgates for medication. Which, of course, brings us to the next logical question. If the theory is debatable and the diagnostic tools were maybe designed for easy prescription, well, how effective are these medications anyway? According to the source, when you really dig into the data on how well antidepressants work, one little number keeps coming up again and again. 2. Just the number 2. What on earth could that possibly mean? Well, here it is. On a common 52-point scale used to measure depression, studies apparently found that SSRIs only improved a patient's score by 2 points more than a placebo. A sugar pill. The source argues that this difference is so tiny, it's pretty much statistically meaningless. And when you put it side by side with other things, the contrast is, wow, it's stark. The studies that our source cites suggest that something as simple as exercise is 5 times more potent in treating the symptoms of depression. 5 times! And it's not just about how well they work. The source points to some really significant and frankly troubling risks. It alleges that early drug trials actually concealed data about suicidal and even violent thoughts in kids taking these SSRIs. And then there are other reported side effects, like a kind of profound emotional numbing and the potential to damage the very personal relationships a person needs the most. I mean, those are just catastrophic outcomes for someone who's just trying to get help. So, okay, if the whole chemical imbalance theory is on shaky ground and the primary treatment has some pretty limited effectiveness, what else could be going on? What other factors might be contributing to depression? This is where the source points to a fascinating correlation. Depression rates absolutely skyrocketed in the 1980s. So, what else happened in the 80s? Well, there was a massive systemic shift in the American diet, away from whole foods and towards cheap, convenient, ultra-processed stuff. And this just opens up a completely different way of looking at the problem. The source suggests that instead of this being a primary brain chemical issue, maybe a lot of depressive symptoms are actually rooted in the body, specifically things like chronic inflammation and poor insulin response, which are both heavily linked to a diet that's high in sugar and processed foods. And all of this leaves us with a final and absolutely crucial question. The source material we've gone through today puts forward a really powerful argument that our entire framework for understanding and treating depression was heavily influenced, if not created, by the pharmaceutical industry to sell a product. So if that's even partially true, what does it mean for the millions of people who've been diagnosed? And what should the future of mental health care actually look like?